Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wishwell Farms. My name is Jason, and in today's video, I will be sharing 8 tomato growing tips that we have been using on our farm for the past 20 years to help us successfully grow strong, healthy tomato plants and tomatoes year after year. So if you want tomatoes that look like these, you're not going to want to miss this one. And stay tuned till the very end, because tip number 8 might be something you have never heard of before that could be a game changer. Now, before we dive into tip number 1, there are 2 things I would like to mention first. First of all, most of these tips are more suited for indeterminate style of tomatoes versus determinate. And secondly, we're not going to be discussing anything about nutrition or fertilizers today. These 8 tips are mainly plant maintenance tips to help you get the very most out of your tomatoes this growing season. All right, let's dive in to tip number 1. All right, for tip number 1, we're going to be stepping inside one of our different greenhouses. And here we have planting number 2 on our farm. And the reason I brought you in here for tip number 1 and 2 is because tip number 1 is sucker removal, sucker pruning. Yes, that might be one of the most obvious and well-known tips for growing indeterminate tomatoes, but it is one of the most important. So sucker removal is very important because in indeterminate plants, we only want one main stem or stalk. We don't want it to be a bushy plant. We don't want to let all these little suckers grow at every branch to create a bush style plant. Indeterminates are made to be one stalk. So here is a sucker right here. We don't ever want them to get any bigger than this. This is probably a 6 or 7 inch sucker. We would prefer to get them when they're more like this size, about 4 to 5 inches, maybe even 3. So we just snap them off. You snap them back and forth and you try to avoid peeling the skin. They have a natural breaking point there, but if you peel the skin when you're breaking them off, it's almost like taking the bark off a tree. You're exposing that plant to possible disease issues in the future. Here's a little sucker right here. I like to remove them when they're about that size. That way the suckers are not taken away from the plant. We want the plant to put all of its energy into fruit production and growing that one main stalk. So I'll just take you down through here and remove some suckers so you can see what I'm doing. There, see how I just peeled the skin? It's easy to do, even though I've been doing this for over 20 years. It still happens from time to time, but you want to try to avoid that. There's a little one down here that's starting. So you can see we got one main stalk. And you got to be careful not to prune the very top. That's the growing point of the plant. It looks almost like a sucker, but it is usually straight at the top of the main stalk. So here's our main stalk, and here's our little sucker. They typically grow diagonally. You know, you got your branches that are horizontal, you got your main stalk that is vertical, and often we'll have a sucker that is diagonal. So they usually stand out quite a bit. And once you do this for a while, you start getting the eye for it, and you can just fly right down the row and easily see the suckers. Now see, this plant doesn't really have one that's ready to be picked, but there's the one that's going to be big by next week. See that little guy? It's only about an inch. So this is how we usually like to take them when they're about that size right there. Sucker removal is something we have to do every week on every plant in every greenhouse. But it's very important because if they get ahead of you, they can really take away from the plant. First of all, they're going to create a big mess. Secondly, the plant is going to put energy into growing that sucker to produce more flowers and more fruit. But if we keep that down to one stalk, by removing those suckers, the energy will be put into the tomatoes instead of the suckers. All right, tip number 2 is fruit pruning. Now, this one might not be as critical for you to do in your garden, but when you're growing on a commercial basis for the fresh market and retailing or wholesaling your tomatoes, in order to get larger, consistent size of tomatoes, we want to fruit prune our clusters down to a minimum of 3 tomatoes. Sometimes we'll leave up to 4. This year, we are leaving 3 tomatoes on every cluster. Now, in your home garden, if you're not worried about tomato size, or even having a few ugly, odd-shaped tomatoes, then fruit pruning might not be that necessary. But even in your gardens, it's probably good practice to remove some of them, because sometimes clusters could have 7, 8, 9. I've even seen 10 or more tomatoes on clusters. If you allow all those tomatoes to remain on the plant, it can actually overwhelm the plant and possibly even quit producing tomatoes later in the season. So it's just good practice to remove a few of the tomatoes. That way the plant continues to produce more fruit throughout the entire season. Here's how we remove the fruit. So we just use a pair of scissors. Here's a good example right here. So we got 1, 2, 3 nice looking tomatoes. I will be cutting that off right there. So I'm cutting off number 4 and 5 and that little leaf growing on the end that has another little cluster of tomatoes. So we don't want that all to produce tomatoes. We want them to just be 3 like that. Right here is another perfect example. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 tomatoes that are going to form on this cluster. We're going to cut that end off, and there's our 3 we're going to keep. All right, I'll just give you a couple more quick examples here. So here's 4 nice tomatoes on this cluster. I'm often tempted to leave that 4th one, and it might do just fine if we did leave it. But see how it is a little undersized from the other 3? I'm going to go ahead and remove that one. Now, some of you may be thinking that I'm trimming off potential profits. That's not the case for 2 reasons. One, this allows us to have bigger tomatoes, gives us more poundage. Larger tomatoes sell better for us at the market. So I would prefer to have large tomatoes on these plants and not 5, 6, 7 medium to small size tomatoes. The second reason I don't want to leave 5, 6, 7 or even more tomatoes on each cluster is that it can really overload the plant. And later on, it may be cluster 5, 6, or 7. It might actually quit producing tomatoes for a cluster. I call it throwing a cluster of blanks. I don't know if that's the right term, but that's what we call it. So it might just skip a cluster. So that ends up costing us huge because there's a week of no tomato production. Yeah, it's not going to happen all at the same time throughout the greenhouse, but a lot of times the plants are in very similar stages of growth, and we can have a week where we are very short on supply. So by keeping them trimmed down to 3 or 4, we're more likely to never skip a cluster and have a bunch of blanks with no fruit growing, which ends up costing us money. And a final reason for fruit pruning is it's a great time to remove ugly or misshapen fruit. Now, I know some of you may like those big ugly tomatoes and they don't taste any different, but a majority of our patrons want that perfect looking tomato. So it's a great opportunity to remove those from the plant. That way we're left with 3 perfect tomatoes. All right, I'm back in the other greenhouse for tip number 3, where the plants are a little further along and more mature. And now we're going to talk about branch removal. So each week, every plant is going to produce 3 new branches at the top, at the growing point. So if we look real close here, there's the 3 new branches that are going to be expanding throughout this week and will look like these by next week. And they're still pointing upwards a little bit. They're still kind of young and tender. And then the following week, they're going to be fully mature and kind of horizontal, growing away from the main stalk. So here's our 3 new branches that just came out this week. And here's our 3 mature ones from last week. So in order for our plants to be the most efficient tomato producing machines, we don't want these plants to ever have more than 13 mature branches. Actually, they're called leaves, but for the sake of this video, I think it's going to make more sense for me to call them branches, because it seems like this would be a leaf. A leaf here, a leaf here, a leaf here. But actually, this whole branch right here is called one leaf. But we're going to call them branches. So each week, the plant is putting on 3 new branches, and once the plant has 13 mature branches, every week we want to remove the bottom 3 branches. So if we look at this stalk right here, I know these are hydroponic tomatoes, but let's just assume this is soil and this is in your garden. So here's the base of the plant at the soil level, and we got about 16 inches up to this first branch. It's because we've already removed 6 branches. There was one here, 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 and one on the other side. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been removing branches. Next week, we will remove this one, and this one. So it would be a big bushy mess down here right now if we had not removed any branches. So let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So there's probably only 12 mature branches because this one's not quite there. That's number 13. And then we got 14, 15, 16, 17 if you count the little ones at the very top. So another important reason that we do this is not only to keep this plant efficiently producing big tomatoes over and over and over every week throughout its life, it also opens up the area down here for more airflow, which is going to help prevent diseases. If it was all bushy and congested down here, it's going to be more humid. There's not going to be any natural airflow, and that's what disease is like. So in our greenhouses, we do this not only for those reasons that I just mentioned, but it just keeps things from being all tangled up down here. We can see our ripe tomatoes better when we start picking. It doesn't get all tangled up with these dripper lines and other stalks because these are planted fairly close together. And you would even see these branches start to yellow and discolor over time. So that's another good reason to remove these branches, just to keep things nice, neat, and clean and fresh. And having 13 mature branches on each plant is optimal. Tip number 4, keeping your tomatoes trellised. It will help keep the tomatoes clean, healthier, drier, and easier to harvest. The way we do it in our greenhouses is that we have an overhead cable with tomato hooks with string on them dropped down and clipped to the tomatoes. Now I realize this might not be the way you would do it out in your garden or in the open field, but there are ways to do a makeshift trellis system. But the main thing I wanted to talk about in this tip is how we clip our tomato plants to the string in case you are using an overhead trellis system. If you're not, others are using things like tomato cages or the Florida weave. I've done several videos on the Florida weave already. I will put a link in the description box below if you want to check out that video. But for this video, we're going to talk about clipping. So these are a simple plastic tomato clip. They have a little claw in the center where the string goes. And as soon as you start shutting that clip, it won't slide up and down on the string. So we want to put that clip under one of these main mature branches, and they just snap together. If we didn't put these on, these plants would be falling over and breaking and tangling up with each other. So it's important to keep your tomatoes in a nice, straight, organized line, whether you're using a clip, a tomato cage, the Florida weave, or some other trellising method. The other main purpose that the clip serves for us is that these tomatoes are making this plant heavy. So you can see we got some decent sized fruit right here. Man, those are almost big enough for making fried green tomatoes. So even though that's cluster number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5 is in the flower stage up there, soon we're gonna have 7 clusters of fruit from bucket height up to the string. There'll be 7 clusters in there, and that is a lot of weight, especially when you got all full-size tomatoes bigger than this that'll be close to a ½ pound or bigger each. So the weight of the plant is resting on these clips. You can see here, this is a pretty good example. See how that clip is angled down? There's a lot of weight setting on that clip. So we distribute that weight between all these clips underneath a main branch. You can see that one's not really touching, but it's not far from a main branch. All the way down the plant. And there's a lot of weight on that one there. And that keeps our plant attached to the string, upright, and not wanting to sag like it would if it wasn't attached with clips. Tip number 5, the lower and leaning method. Now this tip might not be the most practical tip for you home gardeners, but when you grow on a large scale, high density in a greenhouse with indeterminate plants, it's essential for keeping the growing area of the plant at a manageable level and just keeping everything well organized and maintained in the greenhouse. So maybe there's something you can take away from this to utilize in your own garden, but if not, please don't click off, because the final 3 tips, I promise you, are going to be something you can implement in your garden that will be helpful. So when the plant reaches this tomato hook or the wire trellis up here. We don't want it to grow higher than that. So we're going to lower it and lean it into the previous position of the plant ahead of it. These indeterminate plants in this greenhouse will grow 20 feet in 1 year. That would be out the top of this greenhouse. So in order to prevent that, we need to lower it and lean it. So this plant, come off the cable, unwind it one turn and move it to where the plant was ahead of it. Now we have this space here. This plant is going to move into this space. So you can see it's up to the hook. Take it off the wire, unwind it, and slide it down. Our plants are 16 inches apart, by the way. Now you can see the top of this plant where the suckers and the fruit are right at chest to face height to be easily worked on. So this plant's up to the wire. Get the fan jet convection tube out of the way. Take it off the hook, unwind it a turn, and put it where the previous plant was. So we're going to repeat this process all the way down the row. So even though I'm walking counterclockwise, the plants are leaning clockwise all the way around the greenhouse. We have to do this each week to every plant in every greenhouse once they've reached the trellis. This is another reason that we remove 3 branches on the bottom, because the 3 that we are going to remove next week are now down there at bucket level. And if we hadn't removed the 6 branches prior over the last 2 weeks, it would just be a big bushy mess of branches on the ground. So now our plants in this area are nice and organized. They're all 16 inches apart approximately and ready to go for another week's worth of growth. Tip number 6, fruit support. So as you can see here, this cluster of tomatoes is hanging. The truss, the tomato truss, which is the support part of the plant here, or the stem, has bent or kinked because of the weight. If you look at the one below it, it is being supported by this piece of plastic called a truss hook, or also known as a J hook. It looks like a J, and it's got 3 different positions to lock into the string. Now, truss hooks typically aren't needed except early in the season, because early in the season you have longer nights and shorter days and less intense sunlight because of it being further in the south. So as the sun, or as the days get longer and the sun gets more above us and more sunlight, there will be less elongating of the plants, including this tomato truss. So early in the season, they tend to elongate just a little bit, which allows them to kink easier. So in order to prevent this or to remedy the problem, we're using these little truss hooks. And you don't have to use a truss hook. You could use anything. I mean, you could put any kind of a little plastic or metal device in there to attach to your tomato cage or your tomato string or your Florida weave. You know, whatever you're using to trellis your tomatoes up with, you can attach that cluster to somewhere on the trellising method you're using to keep them nice and straight. We don't want to kink off that flow of nutrients to these tomatoes. It might prevent them from reaching their full potential in size. So I'm going to take my J hook. I like to use the center position, and I'll put it right there about in the middle of the stalk or the stem. Now, see how it still can slide? When we're bouncing the plants around, lowering and leaning, sometimes they can slide. So what I do is I take the string and wrap it around the top part and lock it in. Now it can't go anywhere. And better yet, it's always nice when the J hook ends up being able to attach to the string right above a clip. Then it can't come down because it's attached to the clip. But that's just a little too far out on this tomato truss. It could kink again as these continue to grow. It could kink it again, so we're gonna leave it where I had it originally. Just like that. Now the fruit is fully supported. A majority of the time, the trusses are beefy enough, thick enough, and strong enough to handle the fruit load, and they don't do that. Sometimes it's a variety thing too. See, I don't think these are ever going to kink and fall. These are very strong, stout tomatoes. Oh, as I say that, there's one right there I need to fix. So Geronimo is the variety over here. They hardly ever need truss hooks. Torero tends to need them more often. So that's why there's more that are falling on this row that need J-hooked. But like I mentioned already, now that the days are getting longer and the sun is more directly above us and more intense, we shouldn't have to do this much longer, so you may not ever even encounter this in your garden planting during the summer months. But if you're planting indoors or in a greenhouse or in a high tunnel, maybe you have encountered the tomatoes kind of kinking and wanting to fall, and keeping them propped up is just a good practice to let all the nutrients into that tomato without being restricted to give you the biggest and most healthiest tomatoes possible. Tip number 7, pollination. Without good pollination, a tomato plant is either going to produce misshapen fruit or no fruit at all. Now, even though tomatoes are self-pollinating because they have the perfect flower containing both male and female parts, they need something still to make the pollination happen. And outdoors, it's normally the wind or other natural pollinating insects like flies and honeybees. But wind is often all it takes to pollinate a tomato flower. So in an enclosed area such as a greenhouse or a high tunnel, without a natural cross breeze, we have to manually pollinate our tomato plants. And there are 2 ways that we accomplish this task. The first way is with this Colgate toothbrush. I have cut all the bristles off, and if I turn it on, I'll put it up here by my mic so you can hear it. Hear it vibrating? This replicates the buzz of a bumblebee, which we'll get to here in a second. So without any wind or bees in here, we have to touch each cluster. And this vibration, it allows it to release the pollen from the anthers of the flower and to get on the female parts of the pistil and pollinate it. So you would have to walk up and down every row and touch every cluster. And as you can see, this would be a long, laborious process. Because in this greenhouse alone, there are 1,000 plants. So I would be out here spending a lot of time touching all these clusters to make sure they're pollinated. But there is an easier way. Domesticated bumblebees delivered by UPS in a box. That's right. I'm gonna shut this little door so they don't come out and attack me. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see them flying around in there. But these boxes come from NATO Pool. I have already done a video about this already. I'm gonna link that down in the description box for you if you wanna check out all the information about how these bumblebees do our pollinating for us in our greenhouses. But they come with a young brood, some worker bees, and a queen, and they last about 8 to 12 weeks on average. So once the bees die off and they're not really seen flying around anymore, I don't really have to worry about replacing them, because by then the days are getting long enough and hot enough that we can roll the sides up on the greenhouses for that natural cross breeze to come through here and do the pollinating for us. But yes, pollination is a very important part of growing big, beautiful, well-shaped tomatoes. And the bumblebees do a phenomenal job at that because of their buzz pollination versus honeybees. People always wonder why I don't have honeybees in here. We do have them flying around outside, but bumblebees or honeybees will typically leave the greenhouse and not stay around. Bumblebees will stay inside the greenhouse, and they also perform buzz pollination. By biting that flower, they do a great job of releasing the pollen from the anthers of the flower to the female parts of the flower to pollinate it. So whether you're doing it manually with a vibrating tool or just relying on the wind or having bumblebees, pollination is critical to having perfect, well-shaped tomatoes in your greenhouses and in your gardens. And the final tip, number 8, watering your plants with the proper pH. This is important because tomatoes require a low pH. And if your pH of your source water is too high, they're not going to be able to get all the nutrients that you are feeding them, even if you are giving them the perfect, well-balanced tomato fertilizer. And whether you're feeding them from your well, city water, or a water catchment system, chances are the pH is going to be above 7. For example, the water I'm feeding my tomatoes with directly out of my well is at a 7.7. Well, I shouldn't say I'm feeding them that. That's what's coming out of my well, 7.7. That is far too high for tomatoes. It's not going to allow all of the nutrients or fertilizers you're feeding them to be fully utilized. It might actually even lock some of them out. There's a lot of chemistry behind all that. I'm not going to get into that, but that's the simple answer. So we want to feed our tomatoes around a 5.8 to 6 pH. You'll probably be okay if you're close to a 6.5 and you don't ever want to go below a 5.5. So 6 is kind of that sweet spot. There are numerous ways you can acidify the water. You know, there's different pH down products you can buy to add to your water before feeding your tomatoes to make sure the pH is correct. And you can buy just a simple pH testing device online on Amazon or something, or litmus paper to make sure you're not feeding a too strong or too low of a pH. Let me show you how we acidify our water. So in our irrigation system, this is our mixing tank where all of our fertilizers and pH down product is getting mixed before it's sent out to feed our tomatoes. So we have 2 different tanks of fertilizer, which I will be doing a video on in the future about what we're feeding our tomatoes. This is our pH down tank. This is a mixture of water and sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid is just battery acid. You can pick up little containers of it at your auto parts store, and the plant does not care that it is sulfuric acid. I've had people freak out that I'm feeding my tomatoes battery acid. That is not the case. The only thing the plants care about is that pH is at the right level, and sulfuric acid is a very inexpensive way to lower the pH of your source water. Now, since we are growing on a large scale in 4 greenhouses with nearly 3,000 plants, we buy our sulfuric acid bulk. This is 3 times stronger than what you will get at the auto parts store. So you can buy these little pint or quart containers, I believe, at the auto parts stores for, topping off your batteries. So if you're a tomato grower, I would highly recommend getting a hold of some sort of acid, whether it's sulfuric acid, citric acid, or some other form of pH down product to help lower the pH of your source water to between 5.5 and 6, and do that before adding your fertilizer. And then add your fertilizer once you have the correct pH, and then feed your tomato plants. Your tomato plants will thank you. They will grow more vigorously, have better flavor. None of the nutrients that you have spent your hard-earned money on to feed your plants will be tied up and wasted. They will all fully be utilized, and you are going to see a difference, I guarantee it. So I know it's not something that has to be done in soil-grown garden tomatoes. The soil allows things to be a little more forgiving, and you can still get an excellent crop without doing this, but I would recommend giving it a shot. You might be surprised. Alrighty folks, there you have it. Those are my 8 tomato growing tips to help you grow the very best tomatoes in 2025. If you have other growing tips that you would like to share, just drop them down in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see y'all again next time down on the farm.